In the world of high-stakes real estate development, where glass towers rose overnight and fortunes shifted before the morning coffee cooled, nobody noticed the woman who kept everything from falling apart. Willa Beckett. Actually, scratch that name. Let me start again. Her name wasn't the kind that turned heads at charity galas or got whispered across boardroom tables. Poppy Strand, 29 years old, senior financial analyst at Vance Capital Partners, one of the most quietly powerful private equity firms operating out of Miami's Brickell corridor, not the flashy kind of powerful, the kind that owned things without announcing it, the kind that made governments nervous. Poppy had worked there for 3 years, 2 months, and, if she was being precise, which she always was, 11 days. In that time, she had restructured 4 failing acquisition portfolios, caught a $2.3 million accounting discrepancy that their external auditors had missed entirely, and learned that the fastest way to become invisible in a room full of beautiful, ambitious people was to be the one actually doing the work. She wasn't a size 0. She never had been. Her mother had been soft-bodied and warm and utterly magnetic in a way that had nothing to do with the shape of her hips, and Poppy had inherited that same architecture, rounded where the world wanted sharp, present in a way that somehow registered as background noise to people who weren't paying attention. She dressed well. She was good at her job. She had a laugh that could fill a room when she let it, which wasn't often at work, because at work she had learned that laughing too loudly made you memorable, and being memorable at Vance Capital was a double-edged thing. She preferred the edge that kept her employed. The man who ran Vance Capital, who ran it in the way that a storm runs a coastline completely and without apology, was named Cade Vance. 37. Third-generation money that had been multiplied into something that made third-generation money look modest. Dark-haired, the kind of jaw that made people straighten up when he walked into a room, not because he demanded it, but because something in the air pressure changed when he arrived. Poppy had been in the same building as Cade Vance approximately 300 times. He had spoken to her directly on 4 of those occasions. 3 were work-related. One was to ask her to move slightly to the left because she was blocking the elevator panel. She was, in every measurable sense, furniture to him. She had made her peace with that. More than peace, she had built a small, efficient life around it. She knew his coffee order, his meeting patterns, which clients made him go quiet in a particular way that meant the deal was already dead, which numbers on a balance sheet made his eyes sharpen. She knew these things the way you know the layout of a house you've lived in long enough, not because you studied it, but because you were simply always there. It was a Tuesday in October when the hurricane changed direction. Not literally. Miami had already survived hurricane season. This was the other kind, the kind that arrived in the form of a phone call to the executive floor at 11:47 p.m., when Poppy was the only person left in the building besides the security guard downstairs, and Cade Vance himself, who famously did not go home at reasonable hours. She heard him before she saw him. His office was at the end of the hall, and his voice carried when he was angry, and he was very angry. "That's not possible," he said, with the particular quiet of someone who had run out of the energy required for volume. "They can't have those files. Those files don't exist outside this building." Poppy set down her pen. She wasn't trying to listen. She genuinely wasn't. But the building was empty and sound traveled, and she had the particular curse of a mind that assembled patterns automatically, the way other people breathed. She was already running the numbers before she understood why. The Meridian deal, the offshore restructuring, the 3 shell companies she had flagged 8 months ago in a routine audit and then been quietly, firmly told to leave alone by their head of compliance. A man named Douglas Price, who had since departed the company under circumstances that were described as mutual and felt like anything but. She had kept her notes. She always kept her notes. She didn't know why she stood up. Later, she would tell herself it was professional instinct, that she had relevant information and the relevant person was 40 feet away and clearly needed it. That was the practical explanation, and it was probably true. She knocked on his office door at 11:52 p.m. There was a long silence. Then, "It's open." Cade Vance was standing at the floor-to-ceiling window that looked out over Biscayne Bay, his jacket off, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, his phone still in his hand. He looked at her the way people look at something they can't immediately classify, not unkind, just genuinely uncertain. "Strand," he said after a moment. He knew her name. She hadn't been sure he knew her name. "The Meridian files," she said, because there was no version of this conversation that benefited from preamble. "I did a preliminary audit on the offshore structure 8 months ago. Price told me to stop. I kept my working notes." The room was very quiet. "Why?" Cade said slowly. "Did you keep your working notes? Because something didn't add up, and I don't throw away things that don't add up. I have them on an encrypted personal drive, not company servers." She paused. "I thought you should know they exist." He looked at her for a long moment. Not through her, at her. It was startling enough that she had to work to hold still. They worked through the night. This was not the romantic version of working through the night that gets described in certain kinds of stories, candlelight and meaningful glances over scattered papers. This was two people at a conference table surrounded by printed spreadsheets and cold coffee, speaking almost entirely in numbers, and it was the most fully seen Poppy had felt in 3 years. He was faster than she expected. He caught things she pointed at before she finished explaining them, asked questions that jumped 3 steps ahead, made connections she'd missed because she'd been too close to the data. She caught things he missed because she had a different angle on it. By 4 in the morning they had a complete picture of what had been moved, where it had gone, and exactly how much exposure Vance Capital was carrying because of it. It was bad. It was very bad. It was also fixable, but only if they moved in the next 72 hours. "How did you find the original discrepancy?" he asked, at some point around 3:30. They had stopped speaking formally around the 2 o'clock mark. The room had the particular intimacy of shared crisis. "The timing intervals between transfers," she said. "They were too regular. Real transactions have friction. These were engineered. I noticed it because I've been looking at this portfolio for 8 months, and I know what organic variability looks like on these accounts." He was quiet for a moment. "You've been watching this portfolio for 8 months. I watch all the portfolio. That's not your job." "No," she agreed. He looked at her again. That same look. She was beginning to understand it. It was what he looked like when something surprised him, and she got the impression that not many things did. The sun came up over the bay while they were still working, pink and gold and unbothered by any of it. At 6:15, Cade sat back in his chair, rubbed his face with both hands, and said, "You're not leaving this building today." She blinked. "I'm sorry. The people who made that call last night, whoever tipped them off about the files, I don't know yet how far the leak goes internally. Until I do, I need you here. I need you accessible. You're the only one who has the full picture of what we're dealing with, and I need that picture in a place I can trust." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not asking you to be comfortable. I'm telling you it's necessary. You could just ask for the drive," she said. "I need your brain, not just the drive." A pause. "Please." She hadn't expected the please. She stayed. The next 3 days were unlike anything in Poppy Strand's reasonably eventful professional life. The building was locked down under the auspices of a systems security review. A lawyer arrived at 7 a.m. and did not leave until 10 p.m. Cade's 2 most trusted lieutenants, men she recognized but had never spoken to, were brought in and briefed in a room she was not invited into, though she was asked for specific numbers twice through a closed door. Cade himself moved through the crisis the way she imagined a surgeon moved through a procedure, focused, economical, without the performance of calm that people put on when they were frightened. He was just actually calm, or something adjacent to calm that functioned the same way. He brought her food. This was the thing she couldn't quite process. At no point in 3 days did he forget that she was in the building and hadn't slept properly. Coffee appeared. Sandwiches appeared. Once, items, a bowl of fruit that she was fairly certain his assistant had been directed to acquire specifically because she'd mentioned offhandedly that she didn't eat well under stress. "You don't have to feed me," she said at some point during the second day. "You rebuilt an entire financial exposure map in 6 hours on 3-year-old notes," he said, without looking up from his screen. "The least I can do is make sure you have fruit." She didn't know what to do with that. She ate the fruit. On the third night, when the worst of it had been contained, the exposure capped, the relevant authorities notified on their own terms, the internal leak identified and quietly excised from the company's personnel roster, the building was finally quiet again in a different way. Not the taut silence of crisis, something looser. Poppy was packing up her things at the conference table when Cade came back from his last call of the evening. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her in a way she couldn't read, and she had gotten fairly good at reading him over 72 hours of sustained proximity. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked up. "I've worked alongside you for 3 years," he said, "and I didn't know what I had." The words were so direct and so unvarnished that she didn't have an immediate response. "I'm not looking for anything," she said finally, because she needed to establish that immediately, for her own sake, as much as anything. "I did what made sense to do. You don't owe me anything beyond my regular salary, which I'd actually like to have a conversation about at some point." But that separate something shifted in his expression. It might have been the beginning of a smile. "Asa Goads." "I'd like to have that conversation," he said, "and several others. When you've slept." She went home. She slept for 11 hours. She woke up to 3 text messages from a number she had to check twice before she believed it was real, because the number was Cade Vance's personal cell, which she had only because he'd given it to her during the crisis, and which she had assumed would become irrelevant the moment the crisis ended. The first message said, "The board wants to bring you in, formally, director-level financial oversight." The second said, "I'd like to take you to dinner to discuss it if that's something you'd be open to." The third said, "And I apologize again about the elevator 3 years ago." "You were not in the way?" She sat with her phone for a long time. She said yes to dinner. She said it because she was practical and the offer was real, and she had learned, somewhere in 72 hours of crisis, that the man behind the impossible jaw and the hurricane silence was someone whose mind she genuinely respected. That was a rarer thing than money or power, and she knew it. What she did not say yes to, or no to, or anything at all to, because she didn't yet know it existed, was the fact that 3 weeks later she was going to stand in a pharmacy near her apartment in Coral Gables and stare at a test result that would rearrange every single calculation she had ever made about her life. She had been careful. She had been very careful. But careful is a word that describes intention, and intention is not always equal to outcome, and the night of the third day, the night when the crisis broke and the fruit bowl was empty and the building was quiet in the new way, had not been careful so much as it had been human, and she had been so relieved, and he had been standing very close, and that was the whole explanation. She didn't tell him for 6 weeks. This was not cruelty. This was not strategy. This was Poppy Strand, who processed things internally first and externally only when she was certain, and she needed to be very certain about this before she put it into the world. She went to her doctor. She did the math. She thought about it from every angle the way she thought about everything, and without panic, even when panic would have been understandable. She had the dinner, she had several dinners. She took the director position. She learned that Cade Vance, outside the building, laughed more than she expected, and talked about his dead mother with a quiet grief that made her feel like she was being trusted with something real. She started to think that this was going to be complicated in a different way than she'd prepared for. Then her assistant forwarded an invitation to a company gala, a formal event, client-facing, the kind with a dress code and a guest list. And Poppy arrived to find a woman named Claudia Vane already on Cade's arm, tall, immaculate, the kind of beautiful that required maintenance, and announced itself. The introduction was warm and completely uninformative, and Cade's face gave her absolutely nothing. Poppy spent 45 minutes at that event. She smiled the whole time. She excused herself early with the migraine she did not have, and went home and sat on her bathroom floor and thought, with the particular clarity of cold tile and bad lighting, about what she was actually doing. She emailed her resignation the next morning. She didn't send it, she drafted it. There is a difference. And the difference is that she read it 4 times, and then put her phone face down and went to sleep. She woke up knowing she needed to tell him. Not because she was certain of anything. Not because the path was clear, but because the information existed, and it involved him, and she had never in her life been someone who withheld relevant information from the people who needed it. And she wasn't going to start now because the situation was inconvenient. She called him. He picked up on the second ring, which was unusual. He was usually 3 rings and a pause. "I need to talk to you," she said. "Not at the office, a beat. Is something wrong?" "Something is, yes. I need to see you today." He came to her apartment. This, too, was not what she'd planned. She had suggested a coffee shop, neutral ground, somewhere public and practical, and he had said, "I'll come to you," in a tone that did not suggest negotiation, and she had been too tired to construct a reason that sounded rational. He sat in her kitchen, which was small and extremely organized, and had a view of a ficus tree she had kept alive for 4 years, which was, she had always felt, proof of something. She told him without preamble, because preamble in a situation like this is just postponed reckoning. He was very still. "How long have you known?" he said finally. 6 weeks. The stillness changed quality. 6 weeks. I needed to be sure before I... 6 weeks, Poppy. His voice was quiet, not angry, the other kind of quiet, the one she'd learned to read. "You've been carrying this for 6 weeks. I'm capable of carrying things," she said with more edge than she intended. "I know you are," he said. "You're the most capable person I've ever worked with." "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" He looked at her across her small, organized kitchen, and his expression was something she didn't have a name for yet. "The point is that you didn't have to." She didn't say anything. "Claudia," he said, "is my cousin. She's in town for 3 weeks because her divorce is being finalized and she wanted to be around family. I should have introduced her correctly at the gala. That's on me." Poppy looked at the ficus tree. "I thought," she started. "I know what you thought." He stood up, and the kitchen was suddenly very small. "I've been trying to figure out how to have this conversation with you for 4 weeks, which makes me a coward. And I understand if that changes how you see this. But I need you to understand something." He stopped directly in front of her. "I don't have casual. I've never had casual. What happened that night was not casual for me, and everything that has happened since has not been casual for me. And if you think I'm going to sit across from you and be measured about the fact that you're carrying my child, you don't know me as well as I thought you did." "I know you very well," she said. Her voice was strange. She didn't recognize it. "Then you know," he said, "that I'm not going to let you do this alone. I haven't asked. I'm not waiting to be asked." She stood in her kitchen for a moment that felt longer than it was. "I need you to understand," she said carefully, "that I'm not doing this because of the position, or the money, or any of that. I'm doing this because..." She stopped, restarted. "I'm going to do this regardless of what you do. I want that to be absolutely clear. I'm not here because I need to be." "I know," he said. "That's the only reason I trust it." They stood there in the small kitchen with the ficus tree and the 4 years' worth of accumulated ordinary Tuesday mornings, and something shifted in the air between them the way air shifts when weather changes. "Dinner," he said, "tonight. And this time we're talking about all of it." "All of it," she said. "All of it." She said yes. Again. 6 months later, Poppy Strand stood in the atrium of the Vance Capital building, now technically Vance Capital Partners, with a board restructuring that had added her name to a doorplate in a way she still found mildly surreal, at the company's annual investors' dinner. She was visibly, unmistakably pregnant, in a green dress she had bought herself because it fit, and she liked the color, and she had made the decision approximately 1 week ago that she was done performing comfort. She didn't feel about her own body in a room full of people who were going to form opinions about it regardless. She was talking to an investor from Dallas, a woman in her 60s who had made her money in oil and pivoted to real estate development and had the handshake of someone who had never once waited for permission when Cade came to stand beside her. He didn't touch her first. He looked at her. That look, the one she could read now, had been reading for months, and then he spoke to the room in the specific way that made rooms listen. "I want to take a moment," he said, to the assembled investors and partners and clients who composed the precise ecosystem of his professional world, "to introduce someone most of you have already met in her professional capacity, and who has been essential to this firm since before I was paying proper attention." He paused, and she saw the corner of his mouth, the thing that meant he was about to say something that surprised even himself. Poppy Strand, Director of Financial Oversight, and the person who in approximately 9 weeks is going to make me a father, and who has made me considerably smarter about what I was looking at for 3 years without seeing it. The room responded warmly. The woman from Dallas patted Poppy's arm and said, "Smart man," knowing when he's been slow on the uptake, which made Poppy laugh. Actually laugh, the kind that filled the room. Later, when the investors had gone and the caterers were dismantling the atrium and the building had exhaled into its nighttime configuration, Cade found her at the window that looked out over the same bay they'd watched the sun rise over in October. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. In front of all of them. I know." He stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the lights on the water. "You spent 3 years making this place work from the background. I'm not interested in you being in the background anymore." She thought about that Tuesday in October. The spreadsheets and the cold coffee and the fruit bowl and the way he had looked at her, actually at her, for the first time. She thought about what it had taken to walk down that hall and knock on that door, and how the part she was most proud of, in retrospect, wasn't that she'd saved the company money or exposed the fraud or reconstructed the entire financial map from memory. It was that she'd knocked on the door at all. She had spent a long time making herself small enough to keep. It had turned out that the trick was never about size. It was about who was paying attention. And some people, she had learned, some slow, distracted, ultimately observant people, just needed the right moment to finally look up. The bay was very bright, the city was very loud. Somewhere in it, ordinary Tuesdays were accumulating into something that felt, for the first time in a long time, exactly like hers.